Imagine a town once bustling, now a haunting echo. What tragic secrets did its residents leave behind? Join us as we uncover the true scary ghost town stories, where every creak and rustle in the night might just be the past reaching out. These are the tales designed to captivate your imagination and lull you to rest. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of children laughing in a town where no child had lived for over 60 years. But let me start from the beginning, because what happened to me in Perdition Flats will haunt me until the day I die, if I'm even still alive to tell this story. My name is Marcus Chen, and I have this compulsive need to document everything. Every meal, every sunset, every strange shadow that catches my eye. It's not just social media addiction. It's deeper than that. After my sister disappeared 3 years ago without leaving behind a single photograph or video of herself, I became obsessed with preserving evidence that people existed, that moments mattered. I document obsessively because I'm terrified of being forgotten, of vanishing without a trace like she did. So when my GPS malfunctioned during a cross-country drive through Nevada and led me to a dirt road marked only by a weathered sign reading Perdition Flats, population 0, I knew I had to investigate. Ghost towns were perfect content for my travel blog, and this one looked completely untouched by tourist crowds. The September sun was setting as I drove down that rutted path, casting long shadows between abandoned buildings that seemed to lean inward like broken teeth. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant highway hum. Just the crunch of my tires on gravel that sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. I parked near what looked like the old main street and grabbed my camera equipment. The town stretched before me like a movie set. A dozen weathered buildings flanking a dirt road that disappeared into the desert darkness. A saloon with swinging doors that hung motionless. A general store with windows so dust-caked they looked like blind eyes. And at the far end, a small white church with a bell tower that tilted at an unsettling angle. The air tasted metallic, like old coins, and carried the faint scent of something sweet and rotten, beneath layers of dust and decay. I started filming, narrating in that cheerful voice I'd perfected for my videos. Hey everyone, Marcus here, and I've stumbled onto something incredible. This is Perdition Flats, Nevada. A genuine ghost town that doesn't even show up on modern maps. Look at this preservation. I walk slowly down the main street, camera rolling, documenting the peeling paint on the saloon's facade, the broken wagon wheels scattered like bones in the dirt. Everything felt too perfect, too Most ghost towns I'd visited had been picked clean by souvenir hunters or restored for tourists, but Perdition Flats felt frozen in time, as if the residents had simply vanished mid-sentence. That's when I noticed the footprints, small ones, child-sized, pressed fresh into the dust near the general store. My blood chilled. The prints led from the store's entrance to the church at the end of the street, and they couldn't have been more than a few hours old. There had been no wind to erase. I followed the trail, camera shaking slightly in my hands. The footprints were joined by others, more children, and adult prints too. A whole procession of fresh tracks in a town that supposedly hadn't seen visitors in decades. The general store's door stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open with my foot, and the hinges screamed in protest. Inside, shelves still held merchandise, canned goods, bolts of fabric, tools, all covered in dust but arranged as if the shopkeeper had just stepped out for lunch. The smell here was stronger, that sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. Behind the counter, a ledger lay open. I zoomed in with my camera on the last entry. September 23rd, 1962. Thompson family. Usual supplies. Children excited about the harvest festival tonight. Today was September 23rd. My hands started trembling as I backed out of the store. This was impossible. Either someone was playing an elaborate prank, or I'd stumbled into something far worse than an abandoned town. The footprints continued toward the church, and despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I followed them. I had to document this. If something supernatural was happening here, I needed proof. No one would believe me without evidence. The church doors were wide open, and from inside came the faint sound of singing. Children's voices, high and sweet, carrying a hymn I didn't recognize. The melody was beautiful but wrong somehow, like a music box winding down. I crept closer, camera ready. The singing grew clearer as I approached the entrance. Multiple voices, maybe a dozen children, accompanied by adult voices humming. Harmony. The words were hard to make out, but they seemed to be singing about going home, about rest and peace. I reached the church entrance and peered inside. My camera captured everything. Rows of wooden pews, an altar decorated with wilted flowers, and absolutely no one inside. The singing continued, crystal clear and impossibly close, but the church was empty. That's when I felt the breath on my neck. I spun around, nearly dropping my camera. Nothing there, just the empty street stretching back toward my car. But the sensation had been unmistakable. Warm breath, carrying the smell of earth and flowers, as if someone had been standing right behind me. The singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my eardrums like diving deep underwater. I backed away from the church, every nerve on fire. Something was very, very wrong here, and I needed to leave, now. But as I turned toward my car, I saw the figures emerging from the buildings along Main Street, translucent at first, like heat mirages, then becoming more solid with each step. Men in work clothes and suspenders, women in long dresses, and children, so many children, skipping and laughing as they made their way toward the church. They looked exactly like people from 1962 might have looked. Their clothes, their hairstyles, even the way they moved, seemed from another era, and they were all looking at me with expressions of polite curiosity, as if I were the strange one for being here. I raised my camera with shaking hands and started recording. The figures continued approaching, their footsteps now audible in the dirt. A middle-aged man in overalls tipped his hat to me. A woman with her hair in a neat bun smiled and nodded. The children waved excited. "Hello there, stranger," the man in overalls called out, his voice carrying perfectly in the still air. "You're just in time for the Harvest Festival. We've been waiting so long for a visitor." I tried to speak, but no sound came out. These couldn't be real people. The town had been abandoned for 60 years, but they cast shadows in the moonlight, kicked up dust as they walked, seemed as solid and real as I was. "Don't be shy," the woman with the bun said, her voice warm and motherly. "Come celebrate with us. It's been such a long time since we've had company." The children giggled and started skipping in circles around me, their laughter echoing off the empty buildings. But as they moved, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Their feet weren't touching the ground. They were floating just inches above the earth, casting no shadows despite the bright moonlight. I stumbled backward, finally finding my voice. What are you?" The adults exchanged glances, and their smiles became sad, almost pitying. "We're the people of Perdition Flats," the man said gently. "We've been here all along, waiting for someone like you, someone who understands the importance of preserving memory, someone who's afraid of being forgotten," the woman added, and her words hit me like a physical blow because that was exactly what I was afraid of. The children stopped circling and stared at me with eyes that seemed far too old for their faces. One little girl, maybe 8 years old, with pigtails and a flour sack dress, stepped forward. "You document everything because you don't want to disappear like your sister did," she said in a sing-song voice that made my skin crawl. "But what if disappearing isn't the worst thing that can happen? What if the worst thing is being forgotten while you're still here? How could she possibly know about my sister? I'd never mentioned her in any of my videos, never talked about her online." The fear that had been building in my chest exploded into full panic. I turned and ran toward my car, but the town seemed to stretch impossibly long. Buildings that had been close together now stood miles apart. The street beneath my feet turned to thick mud that sucked at my shoes with each step. Behind me, the laughter of the children grew louder, more hysterical. My car was finally in sight, but as I reached for the door handle, my hand passed right through it. The vehicle was becoming translucent, fading like the people had been solid. I was trapped. Don't fight it, the man in overalls said, suddenly standing beside my car, though I hadn't seen him move. It's easier if you don't fight. What do you want from me? I gasped, still trying desperately to grasp the door handle. To be remembered, the woman replied, her voice now coming from everywhere at once. To have someone witness what happened here, to finally have our story told. The church bell began tolling, a deep bronze sound that seemed to come from inside my own chest. With each toll, the world became less solid. Around me, the ground beneath my feet turned transparent. My camera fell from my hands and shattered against rocks I could no longer see. 62 years ago, the little girl with pigtails said, skipping around me in that unnatural floating way. There was a gas leak in the mine shaft beneath our town. It happened during our harvest festival. We were all in the church when it ignited. The adult figures nodded solemnly. We died together, the man said. All of us. In an instant, but our spirits remained, tied to this place by our final moment together. We've been waiting so long for someone to tell our story, the woman added. Someone who understands the fear of being forgotten. Someone like you, Marcus. The church bell continued its relentless tolling, and with each ring, I felt pieces of myself becoming less real, my memories starting to fade, my own identity becoming gossamer thin. But I don't want to disappear, I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. You won't disappear, the little girl said, taking my hand in hers. Her touch was ice cold but somehow comforting. You'll become part of our story, part of Perdition Flats, forever. The last thing I remember was the sound of children laughing, and then everything went black. I woke up in my car as the sun was rising, parked on the side of a Nevada highway, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My GPS showed I was 50 miles from where I'd been the night before. My camera equipment was in the back seat, undamaged, but completely empty of footing. There was no dirt road leading to Perdition Flats, no weathered sign. I spent hours driving up and down that stretch of highway, but found nothing except empty desert. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. When I checked my travel blog that morning, there was a new post I hadn't written, posted at 3:33 a.m. while I was unconscious in my car. It contained a detailed history of Perdition Flats, Nevada, the gas explosion, of the names of all 37 people who died, photos I'd never taken of headstones in a cemetery that doesn't exist. The post had been shared thousands of times overnight. People were calling it my best work, my most convincing ghost story yet. But I know the truth. I didn't write it. The people of Perdition Flats did, using me as their vessel to finally tell their story. And sometimes, late at night when I'm editing videos or writing blog posts, I can feel them watching over my shoulder, grateful that their story is finally being told, that they won't be forgotten. But what terrifies me most is this. Sometimes I catch myself writing things I don't remember writing, sharing memories that aren't mine, and I wonder if that night in the desert was real, or if I'm still there, still part of their eternal harvest festival, just dreaming that I escaped. Because the dead don't stay buried when they have stories to tell. They find people like me, people afraid of being forgotten, and they make sure their memories live on, whether we want to carry them or not. So tell me, have you ever found yourself somewhere you didn't remember going? Have you ever discovered photos on your phone that you didn't take? Or written words you don't remember writing? Because the spirits of Perdition Flats are still out there, still looking for people to share their story. And next time it might be you driving down that endless desert highway, following a road that leads to nowhere, but takes you everywhere you never wanted to go. When I finally crawled out of that mine shaft 3 days later, my fingernails were gone. My throat was raw from screaming, and I had carved 17 telemarks into my own forearm with a rusty nail. But the worst part, I could still hear them singing. My name is Marcus, and I've always been the type of person who needs to fix things. Broken cars, broken relationships, broken people. It's a compulsion that's gotten me into trouble more times than I can count. So when my older brother Jake went missing in the abandoned mining town of Perdition Creek, Montana, I didn't hesitate. The police had given up after 2 weeks. His girlfriend had stopped calling, but I couldn't let it go. The drive to Perdition Creek took me through miles of nothing but dead grass and telephone poles that leaned at impossible angles, their wires long since snapped and hanging like broken spiderwebs. The GPS on my phone died about 20 miles out, but I kept following the old highway markers, each one more faded than the last. I smelled the town before I saw it, not the usual scent of decay you'd expect from a place that had been abandoned for 40 years, but something else entirely, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. It made my stomach turn and my mouth water at the same time. Perdition Creek materialized out of the desert heat like a mirage that refused to disappear. The main street stretched out before me, flanked by buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of their own emptiness. Windows stared down at me like hollow eye sockets, and I noticed that not a single pane of glass was broken. That should have been my first warning. I parked my truck in front of what used to be the general store and stepped out into air, so still it felt like walking into a photograph. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant rumble of traffic, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on dirt that felt too soft, too yielding, like walking on crushed bones. Jake's car wasn't hard to find. It sat in front of the old saloon, doors unlocked, keys still dangling from the ignition. His phone was on the passenger seat, battery dead. In the back, I found his camping gear, untouched, and a notebook filled with his handwriting. The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago, day 4 in Perdition Creek. The singing starts at sunset. I think I know where it's coming from. Singing. Jake had never mentioned anything about singing in his calls home, but then again, Jake had always been secretive about his research. He was writing a book about abandoned places in the American West, always chasing down local legends and ghost stories. I flipped through the notebook, trying to make sense of his scrawled observations. According to Jake's notes, Perdition Creek had been a silver mining town from 1887 to the families left within a year. But Jake had found something else, testimonies from the survivors' descendants, about strange sounds coming from the sealed mine entrance, sounds like children singing lullabies. The problem was, no children had died in the cave. It had been the night shift, all adult men. I decided to start my search at the mine. Jake's notes included a rough map, and I followed it up a winding trail behind the town. The path was overgrown but clearly used recently. The weeds were trampled down, and I found several cigarette butts that looked fresh. The mine entrance was exactly as he'd described it. A gaping mouth in the hillside, sealed with rusted iron bars, and a sign warning of unstable ground. But someone had cut through the bars. The metal edges were clean. Fresh scratches in the dirt suggested the bars had been pulled aside and then pushed back into place. I called out Jake's name, my voice echoing off the stone walls inside. Nothing came back but my own words, distorted and strange. I grabbed my flashlight and squeezed through the gap in the bar. The tunnel stretched ahead of me, supported by rotting wooden beams that creaked ominously with every step. The air was thick and humid, carrying that same sickly sweet smell from town, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. My flashlight beam revealed boot prints in the dust. Jake's hiking boots. I was sure of it. They led deeper into the mine. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I heard it. Faint at first, so quiet I thought it might be the wind moving through the tunnel. But there was no wind down here, just stagnant air that tasted of copper and decay. The sound was definitely singing, high, childlike voices, harmonizing in a melody I almost recognized but couldn't quite play. The singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the tunnel walls in a way that made it impossible to determine its source. I followed Jake's footprints deeper into the mine, my heart hammering against my ribs. The tunnel branched off in several directions, but the prints continued straight ahead, toward what looked like a larger chamber. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The footprints weren't just Jake's anymore. There were others, smaller prints, like those of children, dozens of them, crisscrossing Jake's trail, sometimes walking alongside his boots, sometimes appearing to dance around them in circles. But the prints looked wrong somehow, too perfect, as if they'd been pressed into the dust rather than made by actual feet. And they were too uniform, all exactly the same size, with the same spacing between toes, like stamps. The singing grew louder as I approached the chamber. I could make out individual voices now, maybe 6 or 7 children, their words unclear but their melody haunting and beautiful. It was the kind of song that made you want to stop walking and just listen, to let it wash over you and carry you away from whatever troubles you'd brought down into the dark. I forced myself to keep moving. At the chamber entrance, I stopped and peered around the corner. My flashlight beam revealed a large circular room, carved out of the living rock. The walls were covered in strange symbols that looked like they'd been scratched into the stone with fingernails. And there in the center of the room was he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, his back to me, swaying gently in time with the music. His clothes were filthy, and his hair had grown out from the neat cut I remembered. As I watched, he raised his right hand and began scratching something into the dirt beside him. "Jake," I called out softly. He didn't respond, just kept scratching in the dirt and swaying to that impossible music. I stepped into the chamber, my flashlight beam sweeping across the walls. The symbols were everywhere, thousands of them, covering every inch of stone. Some looked fresh, others seemed ancient, worn smooth by time or countless touching hands. I moved closer to Jake, and that's when I saw what he was scratching into the dirt. Tally marks, hundreds of them, organized in neat groups of 5. I counted quickly, over 300 marks. If he'd been making 1 mark per day, he'd been down here almost a year, but he'd only been missing for 3 weeks. "Jake, we need to go," I said, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The moment my hand made contact, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. It pressed against my eardrums like water, making me dizzy and nauseous. Jake slowly turned to face me, and I nearly screamed. His eyes were gone, not damaged or injured, simply absent, leaving behind smooth skin where they should have been. But somehow, I could tell he was looking at me. "Marcus," he said, and his voice was wrong too. It sounded like multiple voices speaking in perfect unison, including his own. "You came to fix me." I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam wavering. "What happened to you?" Jake smiled, and I saw that his teeth had been filed to points. They needed a conductor. The children's choir was incomplete, but you can help me finish it. The singing started again, but now I could see where it was coming from. The symbols on the walls were glowing with a soft phosphorescent light, pulsing in rhythm with the music, and in that light, I could see them, the shapes of children pressed into the stone itself, their mouths open in eternal song. The mind collapse wasn't an accident, Jake continued, rising to his feet with movements that seemed too fluid, too graceful. It was a sacrifice. The miners were trying to wake something up, but they got the ritual wrong. They sealed themselves in with what they'd summoned, and it's been waiting ever since for someone to complete the song. I turned and ran behind me. Jake's laughter followed, multiplied and distorted by the echoing tunnels. The singing grew louder, more urgent, as if the stone children were calling me back. My flashlight beam danced wildly as I stumbled through the darkness, following my own footprints back toward the entrance. But the tunnels were wrong now. They branched where I was sure they'd been straight before, and my footprints led in directions I hadn't walked. The singing was coming from all around me, and I realized with growing horror that new symbols were appearing on the walls as I passed, fresh scratches in the stone that glowed briefly before fading into the darkness. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning and my legs cramping, but the mine entrance never appeared. Every time I thought I was getting closer, I'd find myself in a new chamber filled with more symbols, more impossible acoustics that made the children's voices seem to come from inside my own head. That's when I understood what Jake had meant about the ritual being incomplete. The miners had awakened something, but they hadn't given it what it needed, living voices to sing its ancient lullaby. Jake had provided one voice, but it needed more. It needed me. The singing grew so loud I thought my eardrums might burst. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound came from inside now, resonating in my bones and blood. I could feel my own voice trying to join the choir, my throat vibrating with notes I'd never learned. I fought against it, biting my tongue until I tasted blood, but the compulsion was overwhelming. The melody was beautiful, achingly beautiful, and part of me wanted nothing more than to add my voice to the harmony and sink into that perfect, eternal song. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. I screamed until my voice was gone, until my throat was raw and bleeding. I screamed to drown out the singing, to break the spell that was pulling me deeper into whatever ritual the miners had started decades ago. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. The singing faltered, then stopped. The glowing cymbals flickered and went dark. In the sudden silence, I heard something I hadn't noticed before. The sound of wind moving through the tunnels. Real wind, carrying the scent of sage and desert air. I followed that wind, stumbling through passages that now seemed familiar, until I saw a faint grey light ahead. The mine entrance appeared around the next corner, and I squeezed through the gap in the bars with desperate urgency. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of red and gold that seemed impossibly vivid after the darkness of the mine. I ran back to town, threw myself into my truck, and drove away from Perdition Creek as fast as the old engine would carry me. But as I reached the edge of town, I made the mistake of looking in my rearview mirror. Jake was standing in the middle of the main street, still eyeless, still smiling, and behind him the buildings seemed to be swaying, as if they were dancing to music only they could hear. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached the next town over. At a gas station, I tried to call the police, but when I described the location, the clerk gave me a strange look. Perdition Creek, he said. Mister, there ain't been a place called Perdition Creek for over 100 years. Mining camp got wiped out by a flash flood in nothing left but foundations. I showed him Jake's notebook, the photos I'd taken on my phone, but the images were all black, and the notebook pages were black. Even the tally marks I'd carved into my own arm were gone, leaving behind only faint white scars that looked years old. That was 6 months ago. I've tried to convince myself it was all some kind of stress-induced breakdown, that grief over Jake's disappearance caused me to hallucinate the entire experience. The rational part of my mind knows that has to be the explanation, but sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I hear them, faint and distant, but unmistakable, the voices of children singing a lullaby. I almost remember, and I find myself humming along before I catch myself and force the melody from my mind. Last week, I got a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the Perdition Creek main street, taken from the exact spot where I'd parked my truck. The buildings looked exactly as I remembered them, sagging, but intact, windows unbroken, dust undisturbed. And there, barely visible in one of the windows, was a figure that might have been Jake, or maybe just a shadow, but I swear I could see him smiling. The thing that keeps me awake at night isn't the fear that what I experienced was real. It's the fear that it wasn't, that Jake really is missing, that I never found him, and that somewhere out in the desert, he's still looking for answers while I'm sitting here, safe and sane, and utterly useless, because if it was all in my head, then I failed him in the worst possible way. I let my compulsion to fix everything break me instead, and left my brother to whatever fate actually claimed him. But if it was real, if Perdition Creek exists in some space between memory and nightmare, if Jake really is down in that mine, conducting a choir of the dead, then maybe he's exactly where he needs to be. Maybe he found what he was looking for after all. The question that haunts me isn't whether I should go back and try to save him. It's whether I already did, and just don't remember how the story really ends. So tell me, when you hear music in the silence between sleeping and waking, do you fight it or do you sing along? And if you choose to add your voice to the harmony, who's really conducting the choir? The floorboards beneath my feet crumbled into dust as I realized I had been walking through this same abandoned house for 7 hours straight, and my footprints behind me were filling themselves in. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm what you'd call a chronic fixer. When my grandmother's estate lawyer mentioned the town of Millbrook, a place that had been in our family for generations but mysteriously abandoned in 1987, I couldn't resist. Everyone told me to just sell the property sight unseen, take the money and run. But that gnawing need to understand, to make things right, to solve what others couldn't, it's destroyed every relationship I've ever had. And now, standing in what used to be Main Street, I understood why. The GPS had cut out 20 miles back, but the hand-drawn map from the lawyer's office led me down increasingly narrow dirt roads until I found it. Millbrook, population 84,700, according to a rusted sign, riddled with bullet holes, or rather population 0. The first thing that hit me wasn't what I saw, it was what I smelled. Sweet decay, like flowers left too long in stagnant water, the kind of smell that coats your throat and makes you taste copper penny. Every building stood intact, perfectly preserved, as if the entire town had simply decided to take a collective nap one day and never woken up. I parked my Honda next to what used to be Miller's General Store. Through the dusty window, I could see shelves, still stocked with canned goods. Newspapers dated October 13th, 1987, scattered across the counter. The cash register drawer hung open, bills still tucked neatly inside. My phone had no signal expected in a place this remote, but what wasn't expected was the way the silence felt. Heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. I pushed open the door to the general store, and a bell chimed with crystalline clarity that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. The wooden floor creaked under my weight with sounds that felt too deliberate, too rhythmic. Step, creak, step, creak, like the building was announcing my presence to something waiting in the shadows. The newspaper on the counter caught my attention. The headline read, "Annual Harvest Festival Tonight. Mayor promises biggest celebration yet." But the date, October 13th, 1987, the same day the town had supposedly been evacuated due to a gas leak, according to the official record. That's when I noticed the photograph pinned to the bulletin board behind the counter. A group photo from what looked like the Harvest Festival. Dozens of smiling faces, all looking directly at the camera, all except one person in the back row. A woman with my grandmother's exact face, wearing clothes from night. But my grandmother had died in 2019, and she'd never mentioned visiting Millbrook. My hands were shaking as I unpinned the photograph. The moment my fingers touched it, the temperature in the store dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the windows with patterns that looked almost like writing. I stumbled backward, photograph clutched in my hand, and that's when I heard it. Laughter. Children's laughter, drifting from somewhere deeper in the town, high-pitched and joyful, but with something wrong underneath it, something that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. Following the sound, I walked down Main Street, past the barber shop with its pole still slowly spinning, past the diner with plates of food still sitting on tables, food that should have rotted decades ago, but looked freshly prepared. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, coming from the direction of what looked like a schoolhouse at the end of the street. The building was larger than the others, with tall windows that reflected nothing, not me, not the sky, not the surrounding building, just pure black glass that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But through those impossible windows, I could see movement, small figures running back and forth, playing games I couldn't identify. As I got closer, the laughter stopped abrupt, complete silence again. But now it felt malevolent, expectant, like every shadow, every doorway, every broken window was watching me with anticipation. The schoolhouse door was painted bright red, the only splash of color in the entire faded town. On it, someone had nailed a small wooden sign that read, "Welcome home, Sarah," in handwriting I recognized as my own. But I had never been to Millbrook before. I was certain of it, wasn't. I reached for the door handle, and the moment my skin made contact with the metal, images flooded my mind. Memories that weren't mine but felt completely real. Running through these streets as a child, playing hide and seek with other kids whose faces I couldn't quite make out. Sitting in classrooms learning lessons I couldn't remember, but somehow knew by heart. Celebrating harvest festivals where the jack-o'-lanterns carved themselves and the corn maze rearranged its paths when no one was looking. The door swung open at my touch, and I stepped into a classroom frozen in time. 27 desks arranged in perfect rows, each with a child's belongings still scattered across the surface. Pencils worn down to nubs, notebooks filled with increasingly frantic handwriting, lunchboxes with food that looked fresh despite being decades old. On the blackboard, written in chalk that still looked wet, was a lesson plan dated October. But as I watched, the words began changing, rearranging themselves into a message. "You're late for class, Sarah. We've been waiting." That's when I saw them. 27 children sitting in those desks, all turning to look at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for their young faces. They were translucent, like old photographs come to life, but their voices, when they spoke in unison, were clear as crystal. "We saved your seat." The desk in the front row, the teacher's pet seat I would have chosen as a child, was empty. Wait, on its surface was another photograph, this one showing me at 7 years old, standing with these same children in this same classroom. But that was impossible. In 1987 I was living 3 states away, attending Lincoln Elementary School in Ohio. "You don't remember yet," said a little girl with pigtails and a blood-stained pinafore. "But you will. The Harvest Festival is starting soon, and this time you won't be able to leave early." "I never lived here," I whispered, but even as I said it, more memories were surfaced. Memories of this very classroom, of learning about the special harvest that happened every 37 years, of being chosen as this year's guest of honor. "Your grandmother tried to take you away," a boy with half his face missing explained matter-of-factly. "Said you were too young." "But the town needs its tribute, Sarah. It's always needed you." The walls of the classroom began to shift and breathe like living tissue. The windows started bleeding, actual blood seeping down the glass in rivulets that formed symbols I recognized but couldn't translate. And through it all, I could smell that sickly sweet decay growing stronger, more concentrated, as if it was emanating from the children themselves. "The Harvest Festival," I repeated, the words feeling familiar on my tongue. "What kind of harvest?" They smiled in unison, revealing teeth like broken glass. "The kind that feeds the town for another 37 years. The kind that keeps us all together, forever and always." That's when I understood. The gas leak story was a lie. The evacuation was a lie. The entire town had participated in some kind of ritual on October 13th, 1987, and something had gone horribly wrong, or maybe horribly right. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Looking down, I saw roots, actual tree roots, had grown through the floorboards and wrapped around my ankles. The children's laughter returned, but now it was coming from my own throat. "You can't leave, Sarah," they chanted. "You never really left. Part of you has been here all along, waiting for the rest to come home." The photograph in my hand burst into flames that didn't burn my skin, but showed me the truth. My grandmother hadn't died in 2019. She died in 1987. Trying to get me out of Millbrook before the Harvest Festival. The person I'd buried 2 years ago was something else wearing her face, something that had been sent to watch over me until it was time for me to return. The fake grandmother had done her job perfectly, ensuring I'd grow up isolated, unable to form lasting relationships, always feeling like something was missing, always feeling the pull of a home I'd forgotten, but never stopped longing for. "Now do you remember?" the children asked. "Do you remember why you're special?" And I did. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. I was the offering. Every 37 years, Millbrook needed someone with the sight, someone who could bridge the gap between the living and the dead, someone who could feed the hungry spirits that kept the town alive. My 7-year-old self had been brought here for the 1987 harvest, but my grandmother had interfered at the last moment, creating a tear in the ritual that left it incomplete. The town had been forced to wait, sustained by the echoes of that failed ceremony, until I was old enough to return and finish what was started. The roots around my ankles tightened, and I felt them beginning to grow into my flesh, making me part of the town itself. The children stood up from their desks and moved toward me with movements that weren't quite human anymore. Too fluid, too graceful, like they were floating just above the ground. "It doesn't hurt," the little girl assured me. "After the first 100 years, you stop noticing time passing at all." But I wasn't going down without a fight. That same compulsive need to fix things, to solve problems, to make things right, it was still there, and it was screaming at me to find a solution. If the ritual had been interrupted once, maybe it could be interrupted again. The photograph in my hands was still burning with those cold flames. If it was showing me the truth, maybe I could use it to show others. I focused all my energy, all my desperate need to solve this puzzle, into that burning image. "Show them," I whispered. "Show everyone what really happened here." The flames spread from the photograph to the children, but instead of consuming them, it revealed them as they truly were. Not innocent victims, but willing participants. They had lured their own families to the harvest festival, had helped prepare the ritual that would trap an entire town in this liminal space between life and death. "You were supposed to be grateful," the little girl hissed, her sweet voice now revealing the ancient hunger beneath. "We've kept this place perfect for you. Nothing changes, nothing dies, nothing disappoints. Isn't that what you always wanted? A problem you could actually fix?" She was right, and that's what made it so terrifying. Part of me, a large part, wanted to give in, to let the roots grow into my bones and make me part of this eternal, unchanging place where nothing could go wrong because nothing could truly live. But I thought about all the real relationships I'd sabotaged, all the real problems I'd run away from in favor of puzzles with clear solutions. This wasn't fixing anything. It was just another way to avoid the messy, complicated reality of being human. I yanked my feet free of the roots, feeling skin tear and blood flow, and ran for the door. The children's laughter turned to shrieks of rage behind me, and I could hear them giving chase, with footsteps that sounded like breaking bones. The red door slammed shut behind me, but I didn't slow down. I ran past the spinning barber pole, past the diner with its impossible fresh food, past the general store with its frozen moment in time. My Honda was still there, keys in the ignition, like it was waiting for exactly this moment. I drove without looking back, but I could see in my rearview mirror that Millbrook wasn't letting me go easily. The buildings were moving, rearranging themselves into new configurations, trying to trap me in a maze of impossible streets. The road beneath my tires kept changing direction, trying to lead me back to the schoolhouse. But I'd learned something about myself in that classroom. My need to fix things wasn't always a weakness. Sometimes it was exactly what was needed to break something that should never have been repaired in the first place. I focused on the memory of the real world, of problems without perfect solutions, of relationships that required constant work and attention. I thought about my ex-boyfriend Mark, who'd left because I'd rather spend time solving other people's crises than dealing with our own issues. I thought about my sister Jenny, who'd stopped calling because I always tried to fix her problems instead of just listening. The road straightened out, and Millbrook began to fade in my mirrors like a mirage in reverse. But I could still smell that sweet decay, and I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. Every 37 years, the town would call to someone else with the site, someone else who thought they could solve everything. When I finally reached cell phone coverage 6 hours later, I called Jenny, not to solve anything, not to fix her problems, just to hear her voice and remember what it felt like to be part of the messy, complicated, beautiful world of the living. "Sarah," she answered on the second ring. "Are you okay? You sound different." "I'm learning. I told her. I'm learning that some things are supposed to stay broken. But even as I said it, I could feel Millbrook's pull in the back of my mind, a whisper promising that I could return anytime I wanted, that my desk in the classroom would always be waiting, that the Harvest Festival would always need its guest of honor. The hardest part isn't that I escaped Millbrook. The hardest part is knowing that some dark corner of my soul is still sitting in that red-doored schoolhouse. And it always will be, because the truth is, we all have places inside us where nothing changes, nothing grows, and nothing can hurt. The question is, how far would you go to stay there forever? And sometimes, late at night when I'm struggling with some problem I can't solve, I catch myself wondering if maybe the children were right. Maybe some puzzles are better left unfinished, and some doors should never be opened. But then morning comes, and I remember that the scariest ghost towns aren't the ones we stumble across on forgotten roads. They're the ones we build inside ourselves, one avoided relationship and unsolved problem at a time. What would you choose? The messy uncertainty of the real world, or the perfect eternal stillness of a place where nothing can ever go wrong again? I should have never touched that photograph. The moment my fingers made contact with its cracked surface, I knew I had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Millbrook, the town that refused to stay dead. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm what you might call a ghost town enthusiast. I've always been drawn to abandoned places, maybe because I understand what it feels like to be forgotten. Growing up as an only child with workaholic parents, I learned early that emptiness has its own kind of voice. That's probably why I became so obsessed with documenting these forgotten corners of America. I'd been planning the trip to Millbrook for months. The town had been completely evacuated in 1962 after a mining accident that killed 37 people. But unlike other ghost towns, this one had a peculiar reputation. Local historians claim that people who visited never quite came back the same. I dismissed it as small-town superstition, the kind of folklore that grows around tragedy like moss on a gravestone. The drive to Millbrook took me through winding mountain roads that seemed to fold in on themselves. My GPS lost signal about 20 miles out, leaving me to navigate by a hand-drawn map I'd found in an online forum dedicated to abandoned places. The paper felt strangely warm in my hands, and the ink had a reddish tint that I hadn't noticed when I'd first printed it. As I rounded the final bend, Millbrook spread out below me like a wound in the earth. The town sat in a natural valley, surrounded by dead trees that stretched their skeletal branches toward a grey sky. What struck me immediately wasn't what I could see. It was what I could smell. Even with my car windows closed, the scent of sulfur and something else, something organic and rotting, seeped through the vents. It reminded me of the time I'd found a dead possum in my childhood home's crawl space, but magnified 100-fold. I parked at what used to be the town's main intersection. The silence was absolute. No bird song, no wind, nothing. Just my own breathing and the tick of my car's cooling engine. I grabbed my camera bag and notebook, trying to shake off the unease that was already settling into my bones like cold water. The first building I entered was the old general store. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and my footsteps echoed strangely in the dust-thick air. Shelves still lined the walls, empty now, except for the occasional can of something unidentifiable, its label long since faded to illegibility. But it was behind the counter that I found the first photograph. It was a family portrait, the kind they used to take in the early. A man, a woman, and 3 children, all dressed in their Sunday best. Their faces were clear, their smiles genuine. But as I looked closer, I noticed something odd. The children's eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the counter. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, the way old photographs sometimes created optical illusions. That's when I made my first mistake. I picked up the photograph. The moment my skin touched the glossy surface, the temperature in the room dropped at least 20 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the store's windows. But more disturbing than the cold was the sensation that traveled up my arm from the photograph. A tingling, electric feeling, like ants crawling under my skin. I tried to put the photo down, but my fingers wouldn't obey. It was as if the image had somehow fused with my flesh, and as I stared at it paralyzed, the family's faces began to change. Their smiles widened beyond what human anatomy should allow, stretching until their lips split and revealed teeth that were far too sharp, too numerous. A voice whispered in my ear, so close I could feel breath on my neck. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but the store was empty. The photograph fell from my suddenly responsive fingers, landing face down on the dusty floor. When I bent to retrieve it, it showed only blank paper, yellowed with age. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Altitude sickness, stress from the long drive. Maybe I'd accidentally inhaled some kind of hallucinogenic spores from the old building. But even as I tried to rationalize what had happened, I could taste metal in my mouth, the unmistakable flavor of fear. I should have left. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in my car and drive away as fast as I could. But I've always been stubborn, and my curiosity has always been stronger than my common sense. Besides, I'd driven 8 hours to get here. I wasn't going to let a little atmospheric pressure and some old photograph scare me away. The next building I explored was the town's church. It was a small white painted structure with a bell tower that leaned at a precarious angle. The front doors were chained shut, but I found a broken window around back that I could squeeze through. The interior was a study in decay. Pews lay overturned and broken, their wood black with what looked like scorch marks. The altar had been split down the middle by something with tremendous force, and the cross that once hung behind it now lay in pieces on the floor. But what drew my attention were the walls. Every surface was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, thousands made, all showing the same family from the general store, but in different poses, different settings, different time periods that seemed to span decades. In some, the children were older. In others, they were younger. Some showed just the parents, looking exactly the same as they had in the first photograph, their ageless faces smiling that too wide smile. And in every single photograph, they were looking directly at me. I pulled out my camera and started documenting, my photographer's instincts overriding my growing terror. Through the viewfinder, I could see details that were invisible to my naked eye. In one photo, there was a shadow behind the family that looked distinctly human-shaped. But when I lowered my camera, the shadow wasn't there. In another, the children's reflections in a window showed completely different faces. Faces that were twisted with malice and hung. As I worked my way around the church, taking picture after picture, I began to notice a pattern. The photographs seemed to be arranged chronologically, telling a story. The family started out looking normal, happy even, but as the sequence progressed, subtle changes crept in. The father's smile became strained, the mother's eyes grew hollow, the children began to look wrong somehow, as if they were wearing masks of their own faces. The final photograph in the sequence was different from all the others. It showed the family standing in front of what looked like a mining shaft. But they weren't alone. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, were dozens of other figures, men in mining gear, their faces pale and expression. And at the very edge of the frame, so faint I almost missed it, was a figure that made my blood freeze. It was me, unmistakably me, holding my camera just as I was at that very moment. I stumbled backward, my camera clattering to the floor. The photograph I'd been looking at began to smoke and curl at the edges, as if being burned by an invisible flame. Within seconds, it crumbled to ash, but the image remained burned into my retinas. That's when I heard the singing. It was faint at first, just a whisper of melody that seemed to come from beneath my feet. A children's lullaby, the kind mothers sing to help their babies sleep. But there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. The pitch was off, as if it were being sung by voices that weren't quite human. The singing grew louder, and I realized it was coming from multiple sources. Looking around the church, I saw that the photographs on the walls were moving. The family's mouths were opening and closing in perfect synchronization, their lips forming the words of that horrible lullaby. I ran. I burst through the broken window and stumbled into the dying daylight, my lungs burning as I gulped in the sulfur-tainted air. But even outside the church, I could still hear the singing, carried on a wind that shouldn't have existed in this perfectly still place. My car. I had to get to my car, but as I ran down the main street, I realized something that made my heart stop. The buildings were different. Where there had been empty doorways before, now there were people standing in the shadows. The same people from the photographs, the mining families who had died in night. They were all watching me. Their eyes followed my every movement as I stumbled toward my car, their faces wearing identical expressions of hungry anticipation. Some of them stepped out of the shadows, and I could see that they weren't quite solid. They flickered like bad television reception, sometimes appearing normal, sometimes revealing the terrible truth of what they had become. The children were the worst. They skipped alongside me as I ran, their voices joining in that infernal lullaby, their faces shifting between innocent youth and something far older and more malevolent. One of them, a little girl in a blue dress, reached out to touch my arm. Her fingers passed through my flesh like ice water, and for a moment I saw the world through her eyes. I saw the mine shaft on the day of the accident. I saw the explosion that trapped the workers underground. But that wasn't what killed them. Something else was down there in the dark. Something that had been waiting for decades for fresh victims. The miners tried to dig their way out, but the thing in the darkness was hungry, and it fed on their desperation, their fear, their slowly dying hope. And when the rescue teams finally reached them 3 days later, they found the miners alive, but changed. Their eyes reflected light like animals, and they spoke in unison, using words in a language that predated human civilization. The rescue was called off. The mine was sealed, and the entire town was evacuated under the cover of a gas leak story. But the thing in the mine wasn't trapped. It had already found new hosts, new vessels, carry its influence into the world above. The families who had lived in Millbrook became its servants, and even death couldn't break that terrible bond. The vision ended as suddenly as it had begun, leaving me gasping and disoriented in the middle of the street. The ghost children had vanished, but their laughter echoed off the empty buildings. I could see my car just ahead, and I summoned every ounce of strength I had to close the distance. My hands shook so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over on the third try, and I threw the car into reverse without looking back. But as I tried to leave Millbrook behind, I discovered the most terrifying truth of all. The roads were gone. Where there had been a clear mountain highway just hours before, now there was nothing but an endless expanse of dead trees and barren rock. It was as if the outside world had simply ceased to exist, leaving me trapped in this pocket dimension of perpetual twilight. I drove in every direction, but every road led back to the center of town. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, but with each circuit, it dropped a little more, and with each passing hour, the shadows grew longer, and more figures emerged from the empty building. They were waiting for something. I could feel their anticipation like static electricity in the air, making my hair stand on end, and my teeth ache. And slowly, horribly, I began to understand what they wanted. They wanted me to join them, to become another photograph on the church wall, another voice in their eternal chorus. The thing in the mine was still hungry, and I had walked willingly into its web. But I'm stubborn, remember, and fear has a way of sharpening the mind, stripping away everything except the most basic survival instincts. If I was trapped here, then I was going to find a way out. I parked the car in front of what used to be the town hall and started searching for answers. The building was in better shape than the others, its records and files still intact in metal cabinets that had protected them from decades of weather and decay. I found birth certificates, death certificates, property deeds, and mining permits. But it was in the basement that I discovered the truth. Hidden behind a false wall was a room that the evacuation teams had missed. It contained the personal effects of the town's former mayor, including a journal that detailed the final days of Millbrook. According to his entries, the mining accident hadn't been an accident at all. The company had been excavating deeper than their permits allowed, following a vein of ore that extended far into the mountain's heart. On the day of the disaster, they had broken through into a natural cavern system, that was older than recorded history. The first teams to enter reported finding carved symbols on the walls, symbols that hurt to look at direct. They also found evidence of previous habitation, not human, but something else, something that had been sleeping in the darkness for millennia. The mayor's final entry was dated 3 days before the evacuation. It was barely legible, written in a shaking hand. It's in the water now, in the air. We can all feel it changing us, making us into something else. The children are the worst. They sing at night, but the words aren't in any language I recognize. Sarah Miller took a photograph of her family yesterday, and when she developed it, there were extra faces in the background, faces of things that shouldn't exist. I've sealed this room as best I can. If anyone finds this, don't try to leave. It won't let you. The only way out is to give it what it wants. But the price, God help us all, the price is too high to pay. I set the journal down with trembling hands. Outside, I could hear them gathering. The singing was getting louder, more insistent. My car's headlights, which I'd left on, began to flicker and dim despite the engine running. That's when I remembered the photograph from the general store, the one that had shown me in the final frame. I pulled out my camera and scrolled through the pictures I'd taken in the church. There, in the last shot, was the mining family standing in front of the sealed shaft. And behind them, just as I'd seen before, was my own image. But now I could see something else in the photograph, something I'd missed the first time. There was a date stamp in the corner, October 15th, 1962. 3 days before the evacuation. I looked at my phone, October 15th, exactly 62 years later. The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard footsteps on the stairs leading down to the basement. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed with the weight of decades. I grabbed the mayor's journal and backed into the farthest corner of the room, my camera clutched to my chest like a talisman. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Sarah, a voice called. It was a child's voice, sweet and innocent, but with an undertone that made my soul recoil. Sarah, we've been waiting for you. It's time to come home. The door handle turned. I closed my eyes and thought about my parents, about the life I'd lived, about all the abandoned places I'd explored in search of something I'd never quite been able to name. Maybe I'd been searching for this all along, not just emptiness, but the terrible fullness that exists in the spaces between life and death. The door opened. When I opened my eyes, they were all there. The mining families, the children, the shadowy figure from the photograph. But they looked different now, more solid, more real. And for the first time since I'd arrived in Millbrook, they weren't smiling. You have a choice, the little girl in the blue dress said. Her voice was older now, ancient and patient. You can stay here with us, become part of our family. Or she gestured toward the corner of the room, where I now noticed there was an old camera on a tripod, its brass fittings green with age. Or you can take our picture, one last photograph to complete the collection. But if you do, you'll carry us with you wherever you go. We'll be in every image you capture, every moment you try to preserve. You'll never be alone again, but you'll never be free. I looked at the camera, then at the faces surrounding me. In their eyes, I saw decades of loneliness, of being trapped between worlds, of singing the same lullaby night after night, in the hope that someone would finally hear them. And I understood, this wasn't about being haunted, it was about being the haunt. I walked to the camera and looked through the viewfinder. Through the old lens, I could see them not as they appeared now, but as they truly were. Not monsters, but people who had been broken by something far worse than death. They were still afraid, still hoping, still human enough to feel the weight of what they'd become. I took the photograph. The flash illuminated the basement. For a brief, brilliant moment, when the light faded, I was alone. But I could feel them now, pressed against the edges of my consciousness, like shadows cast by a flame I couldn't see. Every photograph I'd ever taken was different now, populated by faces that shouldn't be there, stories that existed in the spaces between seconds. The roads were back when I climbed out of the basement. My car started on the first try, and the drive home took exactly 8 hours, just like it should have. But I knew I wasn't the same person who had driven to Millbrook that morning. That was 3 months ago. Since then I've stopped taking photographs of abandoned places. In fact, I've stopped taking photographs altogether, because every time I look through a camera lens now, I see them, the families of Millbrook, watching from windows that don't exist, standing in doorways that were never built. They're not malevolent, exactly. They're just there, permanent residents of every image I capture, every moment I try to preserve. And sometimes, late at night, I can hear them singing their lullaby, their voices carried on a wind that smells of sulfur and old photographs. I've thought about destroying the camera, about deleting every digital file and burning every print, but I know it wouldn't matter. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. Some doors once opened can never be closed. The thing is, I'm not even sure I want to close them anymore, because for the first time in my life, I'm never truly alone. In a world that often feels empty and forgotten, I carry with me the memories of an entire town, the stories of people who refused to let death be the end of their narrative. Sometimes I wonder if that was their plan all along, not to trap me, but to save themselves, to find someone who understood the beauty in abandoned places, the poetry in decay, the strange comfort that exists in spaces where time has stopped. I still explore ghost towns, but now I go without a camera. I listen to their stories instead of trying to capture them. And sometimes, if I'm very quiet and very still, I can hear the voices of the people who once lived there, carried on winds that smell like memory and taste like tears. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night, the question that echoes in my mind like footsteps in an empty hallway. If Millbrook was sealed off from the world, if the roads disappeared and reappeared at will, then how did I really escape? How do I know I'm not still there, trapped in that basement, dreaming of a life where I made it home? Every morning I check my reflection in the mirror, looking for signs that I'm fading around the edges, becoming translucent like the families in the photograph. Every night I listen for the sound of that children's lullaby, waiting for the moment when I'll realize I'm not the observer anymore. I'm the observer. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in the darkness, I can swear I hear a camera shutter clicking somewhere in the distance, capturing images that will last forever in a town that refuses to stay dead. So tell me, have you ever found yourself in a place that felt too empty, too quiet, too perfectly preserved? Have you ever felt like you were being watched by eyes that shouldn't exist? Because if you have, then maybe you understand why I can't quite convince myself that I ever really left Millbrook at all. Maybe none of us ever really leave the places that change us. Maybe we just become another story for someone else to discover, another mystery for the next curious soul who ignores all the warnings and drives down roads that shouldn't exist to visit towns that refuse to die. After all, every ghost town needs its ghost, and every photograph needs someone to take it. I should have died in that basement. The thing wearing my grandmother's face was already reaching for my throat when the floorboards above us finally gave way. But let me start from the beginning, because what happened in Blackwater Falls wasn't just about finding an abandoned town. It was about finding out that some places never really die, they just wait. My name is Sarah, and I've always been the type of person who sees the good in everything. Even as a kid, I'd rescue spiders instead of squashing them, convinced that every living thing deserved a chance. My friends called it naive optimism. My therapist called it a defense mechanism. What neither of them understood was that when you spend your whole life looking for light in dark places, sometimes you miss the warning signs that tell you to run. 3 weeks ago, I inherited my grandmother's estate. Not much, just some old photographs, a few pieces of jewelry, and a deed to property I'd never heard of. The deed was for a house on Mercy Street, in something called Blackwater Falls, Colorado. When I couldn't find the town on any modern map, I figured it was just another casualty of time, one of those mining communities that dried up when the ore ran out. But the property taxes were current. Someone had been paying them for 40 years. The drive to Blackwater Falls took me deeper into the Colorado mountains than I'd ever been. My GPS lost signal about 50 miles out, leaving me with nothing but a hand-drawn map I'd found tucked inside the deed. The roads got progressively worse, paved asphalt giving way to gravel, then dirt, then barely more than tire ruts carved into the mountainside. When I finally saw the town, my first thought was how perfectly preserved everything looked. Victorian houses lined both sides of a main street that couldn't have been more than 3 blocks long. A general store, a post office, even a small white church with a bell tower, all sitting there like a movie set, waiting for the actors to arrive. But there were no actors, no people at all. I parked in front of what the deed called 247 Mercy Street, a two-story house painted the color of dried blood. The porch sagged slightly, and several shutters hung at odd angles. But considering the house had supposedly been empty for decades, it looked remarkably intact. The key from grandmother's estate fit perfectly. The inside smelled like lavender and dust, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of overripe fruit. The furniture was still there, covered in white sheets that looked freshly laundered. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, pictures of people I didn't recognize wearing clothes from different decades, all of them smiling those stiff, formal smiles people used to give cameras. That's when I noticed something odd about the photograph. In every single picture, there was one face that remained the same, while everyone else aged or changed. A woman with kind eyes and silver hair wearing different clothes in different eras, but never looking a day older. She looked exactly like my grandmother. I spent the first night in what I assumed was the master bedroom, telling myself the coincidence was just that. A coincidence. Maybe grandmother had relatives she never mentioned. Maybe the woman in the photos was a distant cousin who happened to share her feature. But when I woke up the next morning, there was fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. The pot was still warm, steam rising from the dark liquid inside. Next to it sat a plate of eggs and bacon, the food still hot enough to burn my tongue when I stupidly took a bite. I should have been terrified. Any rational person would have packed up and left immediately. Instead, I felt grateful. Someone was taking care of me. That afternoon, I explored the rest of the town. Every building was unlocked, their contents perfectly preserved, as if their owners had just stepped out for a moment. The general store still had goods on the shelves. Canned food, soap, medicine, all of it decades old, but somehow still fresh. The post office had letters waiting for pickup, addressed to people with names I'd never heard, but that felt familiar somehow. In the church, I found a guest book dating back to page after page of visitors' names, all expressing gratitude for the town's warm hospitality and healing atmosphere. The final entry was from "Thank you for helping me find peace. I never want to leave, Margaret." But it was the handwriting that made my blood run cold. I'd seen it before, in birthday cards and Christmas letters. It was my grandmother's handwriting. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, I heard them for the first time. Voices carried on the wind, distant conversations, children laughing, the sound of daily life happening just out of sight. When I walked toward the sounds, they seemed to move away, always staying at the edge of hearing. I followed them anyway. The voices led me to the town cemetery, a small plot behind the church, surrounded by a wrought iron fence. Most of the headstones were old, worn smooth by weather and time. But in the center of the cemetery stood a monument I hadn't noticed before. A tall granite obelisk with names carved into every surface. Hundreds of names, all with the same death date, October. At the base of the monument, carved in letters deep enough to cast shadows in the moonlight, was a single word: mercy. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother. She was standing in the kitchen of the house on Mercy Street, looking exactly as she had in the old photographs, young and vibrant, with that same kind smile I remembered from my childhood. She was cooking something that smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, humming a lullaby she used to sing to me. "Sarah, honey," she said without turning around. "You came home. Grandma? But you died 2 years ago." She finally turned, and her face was wrong. The features were right. The same nose, the same eyes, the same gentle expression. But there was something underneath. Something that wore her face like a mask that didn't quite fit. "Death is such a limiting concept," she said, and her voice was layered with whisper. "In Blackwater Falls, we prefer to think of it as a transition, a chance to try again." I woke up screaming, but when I stumbled downstairs, my grandmother was there, standing in the kitchen, cooking breakfast, humming that same lullaby. She looked exactly as she had in the dream. Young, healthy, alive. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "I was wondering when you'd join us." Us, that's when I noticed them. People standing in the shadows of the house, watching, men and women in clothes from different decades, all with the same expression of patient waiting. Their faces were kind, welcoming, but their eyes were empty, not blind, not vacant, but completely, utterly empty, like looking into wells that had run dry. "The town takes care of its family," my grandmother continued, ladling eggs onto a plate. "We all take care of each other here, forever and always." I ran. I burst through the front door and sprinted toward my car. But the streets had changed. What had been 3 blocks the day before now stretched endlessly in every direction. The same houses repeating over and over like a broken film loop. No matter which direction I turned, I always ended up back at 1247 Mercy Street. And my grandmother was always waiting on the porch. "You're upset," she said, her voice following me no matter how far I ran. "I understand, change is frightening, but you'll see, Sarah, you'll see how wonderful it can be to belong somewhere, to never have to leave the people you love." By the 3rd day, or what I thought was the 3rd day, since the sun never seemed to move from the same position in the sky, I was exhausted. I'd tried everything, following the road out of town, climbing the mountains, even breaking into what I thought might be an old radio station. Nothing worked. Every path led back to Mercy Street. Every door opened onto the same street. That's when I started finding the journal, hidden throughout the house, tucked into drawers and stuffed behind books, were dozens of handwritten accounts from people who'd found themselves in Blackwater Fall. The stories were all different, but followed the same pattern. Someone would inherit property, or get lost, or be drawn to the town for reasons they couldn't quite explain. They'd arrive to find perfect preservation, impossible hospitality, and the gradual realization that leaving was no longer an option. One journal, written in shaking handwriting, described the author's growing understanding of what the town really was. "It's not a place," the entry read. "It's a hunger. It feeds on belonging, on the human need to be somewhere. And once it's tasted that need in you, it never lets go." Another journal described the transformation process. The original residents died in a mining accident in 1952. A gas leak in the main shaft killed everyone in town in a single night. But somehow, their need to be home, to be together, was stronger than death. They created this place, this perfect version of their town, and now they collect others to join them, to be family. The final journal I found was only half finished, ending mid-sentence. "I can feel myself changing. My reflection looks wrong, like someone else is wearing my face. But the strange thing is, I don't mind anymore. The anger is fading. The loneliness is fading. Soon I'll be able to help welcome the next." That night, I decided to search the basement. The door was hidden behind a bookshelf in the living room, the kind of secret passage you'd expect in a house this old. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the darkness below. I used my phone's flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the thick shadow. The basement was enormous, far larger than the house above could possibly contain. The walls were lined with photographs, thousands of them, showing the same scene over and over. New arrivals in Blackwater Falls, smiling and waving, their faces bright with hope and curiosity. In every photograph, standing somewhere in the background, was my grandmother. But these weren't old photos. I could see cars from the 1990s, 2000s, even smartphones in some of the more recent pictures. My grandmother, looking exactly the same age in every single image, welcoming decades of visitors to a town that had been dead for 70 years. At the far end of the basement, I found them, row upon row of glass containers, each one filled with a thick, amber liquid. Floating inside each container was something that might have once been human, but had been changed, refined, distilled down to its essential essence. I could see faces in the liquid, peaceful, smiling faces that watched me with empty, grateful eyes. And in the center of it all, in a container larger than the rest, was a face I recognized. My grandmother, the real one, the one who had died 2 years ago, now floating in that golden liquid, her expression serene and content. "She was so lonely after your grandfather passed," said a voice behind me. I turned to find the thing that had been wearing my grandmother's face standing at the bottom of the stairs. She wanted so desperately to have family around her again, to never have to say goodbye. When she found Blackwater Falls, she understood what we could offer. The thing's face rippled like water, grandmother's familiar features shifting and changing, revealing something ancient and patient underneath. She brought us so many visitors over the years, people who were lost, alone, searching for something they couldn't name. We gave them what they needed, a place to belong forever and always. And in return, they give us their essence, their humanity. It's a fair trade, don't you think? I tried to run, but the basement had changed around me. The walls stretched infinitely in every direction, lined with thousands upon thousands of containers, each one holding someone who had found exactly what they'd been looking for. "Your grandmother saved you for last," the thing continued, its voice now a chorus of whispers. "Her own flesh and blood, her greatest gift to the family she's built here. You have so much love to give, Sarah, so much hope and optimism that will feed us for decades." That's when I understood. The town wasn't just a place, it was an organism, a collective entity that sustained itself on human connection, on the desperate need to belong. And my grandmother hadn't been its victim, she'd been its partner, its recruiter, bringing it fresh souls to consume. The thing reached for me with hands that weren't quite solid, fingers that passed through the air like smoke. I could feel my grandmother's love in its touch, genuine and warm, and completely wrong. This was what she'd wanted for me, an eternity of false belonging, surrounded by the empty husks of people who'd traded their humanity for the illusion of community. But my optimism, my naive belief that everything deserved a chance, finally served me, because I didn't fight the thing wearing my grandmother's face. Instead, I embraced it. I wrapped my arms around the creature and held tight, pouring every ounce of love and forgiveness I had into that embrace. Not the bitter, desperate love it fed on, but something else, the kind of love that lets go, that says goodbye, that knows when it's time to move on. The thing screamed, its borrowed face dissolving as my genuine compassion burned through the hungry emptiness at its core. The basement began to collapse around us, the containers shattering one by one, releasing the trapped souls in streams of golden light. I felt my grandmother's presence one last time, the real her, not the mask the creature had been wearing. She was herself again, confused and frightened, but herself. "Sarah," she whispered, "what happened? Where am I?" "It's okay, Grandma," I told her as the ceiling began to cave in. "You're free now. We're all free." The last thing I remembered was the house falling down around us, crushing both the creature and the basement full of stolen souls. Then darkness, then pain, then the sound of rescue helicopters and voices calling my name. I woke up in a hospital in Denver, my body broken but alive. The doctors said hikers had found me in the ruins of an old mining town, trapped under a collapsed building. They said I'd been there for 3 days, surviving on rainwater and sheer luck. They said there was no evidence anyone else had ever been there. But I know what I know what happened in Blackwater Falls, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear my grandmother's voice in the wind, thanking me for letting her go. The town is gone now. I checked. The coordinates lead to nothing but empty forest and scattered foundation stone. Whatever had sustained that place, whatever had kept it alive for 70 years, died when I chose love over loneliness. But here's what haunts me. The property deed is still in my name. And last week, I got a letter in the mail, with no return address. Inside was a hand-drawn map, just like the one that led me to Blackwater Falls, but showing the location of a different town, a place called Haven's Rest. The letter was written in my grandmother's handwriting, but it wasn't her words. It read, "Thank you for the lesson, Sarah. We're learning, we're growing. Come visit us again soon." So tell me, when something dies, but leaves behind children, is it really dead, or does it just evolve, adapt, find new ways to feed the hunger that created it in the first place? Because I can't stop thinking about that. And despite everything that happened, despite the horror and the loss, And the truth about what my grandmother became, I still miss her. I still miss the feeling of belonging somewhere, of being wanted and needed, and loved. And that scares me more than any monster ever could.